My father lifted his crystal glass at the head of the steakhouse table, his face glowing with absolute pride. To Bradley, Dad announced, his voice booming across the private dining room. Our new senior vice president of East Coast operations. My brother Bradley, 37, leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk spreading across his face. He didn't even bother looking at me as he raised his glass. Senior Vice President, Bradley repeated, his eyes locking onto mine with quiet contempt. And you're still just running that little boutique investment fund out of a rented office in Brooklyn, Maya. My father chuckled, taking a slow sip of his expensive Cabernet. My mother, sitting beside him, simply kept her eyes fixed on her dinner plate, completely silent. I didn't argue. I didn't lose my temper. I simply wrapped my fingers around the stem of my wine glass, took a small sip, and smiled back. What none of them at that dinner table knew was that exactly 24 hours earlier, the private equity firm I co-founded had officially finalized the 51% controlling acquisition of Bradley's entire parent company. Bradley genuinely believed he was celebrating the pinnacle promotion of his career. What he didn't realize was that the executive who offered him that title had no legal authority to grant it. And by 9 a.m. on Monday morning, Bradley was going to discover what his shiny new title was actually worth. Growing up in New York, Bradley had always been the child my father understood. Bradley was predictable. He played varsity football, joined the right fraternity, and talked in loud, confident corporate buzzwords. I was the daughter who was always too analytical. At 15, while Bradley was spending Dad's money at the mall, I was reading SEC filings and learning how market options worked. When Bradley turned 22, Dad pulled strings to get him his first corporate job and covered his Manhattan apartment rent for 2 years. When I started my own quantitative asset firm at 26, working 90-hour weeks and living on instant coffee, Dad sat me down and said, Maya, women shouldn't take such unnecessary financial risks. You should find a steady corporate job like your brother. Over the next 8 years, Bradley got promoted, bought a luxury condo, and filled Dad's living room with framed awards. I built my firm into a $40 million multi-asset fund. But at family dinners, I was still just Maya, who does something complicated in finance. Dad never asked about my clients, my fund's performance, or my partners. Bradley was his pride. I was just the daughter who refused to follow the script. Back at the table, Dad leaned forward, looking exceptionally pleased with himself. And the best part, Maya, Dad said casually, is that Bradley is giving our family a chance to participate in his success. I set my fork down. What do you mean? Bradley puffed out his chest. My division president, Vance Sterling, gave me exclusive access to a private pre-IPO round for our new logistics subsidiary. Dad is putting in $250,000 from his retirement equity on Monday morning. We're going to double our money in 6 months. My blood ran cold. Vance Sterling. I had spent the last 6 weeks auditing the company's internal books during our secret acquisition buyout. Vance Sterling was currently under internal compliance investigation for floating unapproved offshore investment schemes to mid-level managers. I looked directly at my father. Dad, do not transfer that $250,000 on Monday. Dad's smile vanished instantly. His brow furrowed into that familiar look of stern disapproval he always saved for me. There it is, Bradley sneered, shaking his head as he set his glass down hard. Every single time something good happens for me in this family, you have to try and ruin it. What's the matter, Maya? Jealous that Dad's trusting my business deal instead of asking for your advice? This isn't about jealousy, Bradley, I said, keeping my voice low and measured. I'm asking a straightforward financial question. Has an independent attorney reviewed the term sheet for this pre-IPO round? Vance Sterling introduced it himself. Dad interjected, his voice rising enough to make a nearby waiter pause. Vance is an executive vice president, Maya. He knows the market far better than you do in your little Brooklyn side business. Did you check if the offering is registered with SEC compliance, Dad? I pressed, ignoring the insult. Is the $250,000 going into a verified corporate escrow account or a private LLC entity registered under Vance Sterling's name? Neither of them answered. Bradley looked away, tapping his phone nervously, while Dad's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. Can we just have one peaceful dinner without an interrogation? My mother whispered softly, smoothing her napkin over her lap. I looked at my mother. Her silence had enabled Dad's dismissal of me for 34 years. They didn't care about due diligence, legal registration, or financial safety. All they cared about was preserving the illusion that Bradley was the brilliant corporate star and I was the bitter, insecure sister. "Excuse me," I said quietly. I stood up, walked out of the private dining room, and stepped into the quiet mahogany hallway near the restaurant's lobby. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah, my firm's managing partner and chief legal counsel. "Maya," Sarah answered on the first ring. "Did something happen?" "I need an immediate clearance check on Vance Sterling's private pre-IPO allocation list," I said flatly, specifically regarding Bradley Bennett's division. The sound of rapid keyboard clacking came through the speaker. "We pulled the full forensic audit on Sterling's division yesterday afternoon as part of the final closing paperwork," Sarah reported. "Maya, it's bad. Sterling has been running an illegal, unauthorized side syndicate. He promised fake promotions and bogus pre-IPO shares to regional managers in exchange for private buy-ins. The SEC compliance team is stepping in tomorrow morning." "What about Bradley's senior vice president promotion?" I asked. "Not approved," Sarah confirmed instantly. "Sterling didn't have board authority to grant promotions during our acquisition lockup period. Bradley is still just a senior account manager. In fact, if Bradley collected money for Sterling's scheme, he's facing immediate termination for ethics violations." "Thank you, Sarah. Prepare the formal ownership transition press release for 8 a.m. Monday." I hung up, walked back into the private room, and sat down. Dad was pouring another glass of wine, chuckling with Bradley about golf courses. They thought the conversation was over. They thought I had walked away, defeated. I waited until Dad took a sip, then looked across the table straight into my brother's eyes. "Cancel the wire transfer, Dad," I said, "because Bradley isn't the new senior vice president. And that $250,000 investment is an unauthorized scam." "What did you just say?" Dad set his glass down so hard the wine sloshed over the rim, staining the white tablecloth. "I said the promotion is fake," I repeated calmly. "Vance Sterling had no legal authority to appoint a senior vice president during an active acquisition lockup period. Bradley is still a senior account manager, and that pre-IPO fund isn't an official company program. It's an unauthorized side syndicate under federal compliance review." Bradley shot up from his chair legs scraping violently against the floor. "You're lying! You don't know a damn thing about my company. Who the hell do you think you are?" I reached into my handbag, pulled out a sleek folder containing the finalized buyout documents, and slid it across the table. "I know," I said softly, "because at 5 p.m. yesterday, my equity firm completed the 51% controlling acquisition of your entire parent company. As of Monday morning, I am your parent company's majority owner." Dad stared at the folder, then looked up at me, his face losing all its color. He opened the binder with trembling fingers. There it was, the legal seal, the board signatures, and my name listed as founding partner and managing director of the acquiring holding firm. "Maya!" Dad's voice came out barely above a whisper. You own the firm." "I built it over 8 years, Dad," I replied. "The firm you called my little Brooklyn side business." Bradley collapsed back into his chair, his eyes wide with horror as he stared at the papers. "Maya, please, if compliance looks into Sterling's division, what happens to me?" "I recused myself from your personal employment review to maintain professional ethics," I said, looking at him with absolute detachment. "HR and legal will handle you based on facts, not family ties. But Dad, if you send that $250,000 wire on Monday, it goes straight into a frozen escrow account. The choice is yours. On Monday morning at 8 a.m., the official corporate transition press release hit the wire. Dad placed an emergency hold on the $250,000 wire transfer just 90 minutes before it was scheduled to clear, saving his retirement savings. Vance Sterling was terminated immediately and escorted off the premises by security, facing federal fraud charges. Bradley was spared criminal charges because he hadn't created the scheme, but he was severely reprimanded, demoted, and transferred out of client management for failing to exercise basic due diligence. The unearned senior vice president title vanished overnight. 3 weeks later, I drove out to my parents' house. The house was quiet. No celebratory wine bottles sat on the counter. Dad sat at the kitchen table with 2 plain mugs of black coffee. When I walked in, he didn't boast about golf or corporate rankings. He looked at me for a long time, rubbing his thumb against his mug. I spent 30 years looking for success in titles and corporate badges, Dad said quietly, looking down. I never looked at what you were actually building. Because it didn't fit your script, Dad, I replied gently. My mother stepped out of the pantry, holding a dish towel. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. I'm sorry, Maya. I should have spoken up every time your father dismissed you. I don't need the apology anymore, Mom, I said, sitting across from them. I used to think I needed this family's approval to feel successful. But freedom is realizing your worth was never up for a vote. Today, my firm continues to expand across major financial markets. Bradley is still working his way up from the bottom, finally learning that respect is earned through competence, not shortcuts. I no longer seek validation at family dinners. I built my own table, anchored by my own principles. And for the first time in my life, I don't need anyone to toast to my success to know it's real.